So we're going to get started here with flow, and to do that all we need to do is create a new file in the directory called .flowconfig. There doesn't need to be anything in it. And then in the file itself I'll create an a.js file here just as a sample. And then at the top, the second thing you need to do is all of your source files need to have a comment that just says @flow. And this is a way that you can transition kind of gradually over, because it only looks at files that have this at the top. And we'll create a function here I've created in the past. We'll call it add2. Say that it takes two parameters, first and second. And then we'll make this obviously wrong, so we'll return immediately and we'll set a equal to 1. So now if we go over to flow, which I've already installed as a global npm package, we can just type flow and we see that we get unreachable code. So right out of the box, flow's done something good for us. Next, let's see if flow can do something a little bit more complex. So we'll make a new file here, we'll put the flow at the top, and we'll create a getLength function. So let's say this is a function that will get the length of a string and return it. So we'll pass in str, and we'll have the function return str.length. So now if we call this function, first we'll call it with a regular string. So let's just say getLength of, let's say, Michael. And of course we know here that if we ran this, that would return 7. But just to show this something that flow could catch, let's do another one here and we'll pass in null. So we know that null would actually throw an error if this were to run. So we'll go over here, type flow, and sure enough, it's smart enough to catch that, which is pretty cool. So it knows that the length property cannot be accessed on a null value. So what can we do about that? Well, if we go back to our function, of course, we can try to guard against null. So we might say something like, if str is not equal to null, then we'll return the length of our string. Otherwise, let's return null, or better actually, let's return 0. So now if we run this within flow, go back over to our terminal over here, type flow, and we get no errors. So what's pretty cool about this is that flow is actually able to parse this JavaScript code and know that we're checking for null, and therefore this is no longer an error. But what happens here if we type in undefined? So really we're only checking for null. We're not checking against undefined. So if we run flow, sure enough, it's smart enough to realize that we're only checking for null, we're not checking for undefined. So instead, what if we just change our function a little bit here? We'll check for the truthy value of null, and we get no errors. So this is nice for built-in types, but let me get rid of this code here and just see if it works for things that we create custom. So I'm going to create an object here, my object, with no length, and I'll give it a property, let's just say a, just to say that it doesn't have a length. And I'll create another object here called my object with length, and I'll give it a length property. So now I think the cool thing here is if we were to call this function twice, we'll call our getLength function, and we'll call it first my object with length, and we'll call it again my object without length. What's neat here is that even though these aren't built-in types, we've created these objects from scratch, it's still smart enough to determine that we have an object literal that we've created, and it doesn't have a length property, so it's actually going to fail up here. So even though it's passed the null check, it's still created an error because it doesn't have a length property to return. So of course the quick fix here is we'll go up to our function, let's just say if string exists and string has a length property. We'll go back over to flow, and sure enough, flow's smart enough to pass no errors. So next though, flow really expects that you're going to start changing your code around to add type annotations everywhere. So everything we've done so far, we haven't touched our source code. This still runs as plain JavaScript, it still runs in Node, still runs in the browser. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a string annotations that's specific to flow. So use this colon syntax, and I'm going to say that this function expects only a string. And I'm just going to trim down everything else here. So what we did have was we have an object literal, it has a length, but it isn't a string type. And if I type in flow now, it says that I have an object literal, but it's incompatible with type string. So even though this would have passed, so if this were normal JavaScript, this would run, we've said here that we really only want strings, so it's not going to pass. But if I type Michael in here and I type flow, I get no errors. Now I want to dive a little bit deeper into that, because what we've done here is we've now created JavaScript code that we can't just run on its own. So we need a bit of a build step. So I'm going to console log this, and then let's go over here to the terminal and try to run it. So I'll type node a.js, and you see I get an unexpected token with this colon, and it doesn't like this function here where I passed in this new flow annotation. So I need to do something about that. And the way that flow wants you to handle that is I install this flow remove types, and I'll save that as a dev dependency. And now what I can do is I can run that. It's sitting as a bin in our node modules folder, so I'll call it from there. and I'll pass in our a.js file, and I'll pipe it to output.js. So what we've done here is we've created an output.js, and what's interesting about this is it's even preserved the space. So we used to have our @flow at the top, we used to have our string annotation there. But what we're left with is JavaScript that we can run in the browser or in Node. So I'll type node output.js and I get 7, which is the length of our string. So one of the things to remember here is that flow is really just checking your code. It's not actually enforcing anything or preventing your code from running. So I'm going to call our function again here, our getLength function, and I'm going to call it with a thing that we know doesn't pass flow. If I go back over to my terminal, type flow, actually I get here now a lot of checking on our node modules folder. In fact, this flow remove types file module that we installed. So I want to get rid of that. I'll hop over to my flow config. I'll add an ignore for that. Okay, now that we have that ignored, we can go back over to type flow, starts the server again, and you see now we get this type is incompatible with type string. So we're calling our object with a length, so this would pass the function, but it doesn't pass our string type checking. But what we can do is we can go down to our node modules folder, we'll go into our bin, and we'll call this flow remove types. And if we execute that again against our a.js file here, and again we'll just pipe it to output.js, and if we go over and now try to run it, we see that it will output the length 4. So even though that this didn't pass our flow checking, flow does still allow it to be outputted, and it doesn't try to modify that source at all, which is nice. So next up, I want to take a look at how flow deals with third-party packages. So I want to install a package from npm here. We'll just install the pad package, and all that does is it just adds padding to a string. And we also need our flow bin installed locally, so I'll install that real quick with our save dev flag. And now that I have these things, what I can do is I can do a flow typed install. And what this does is it looks at all of your installed npm packages, and it goes out and it tries to find type files for them. So we have our pad package that it was able to find. It was able to find our flow bin, but it wasn't able to find our flow remove types. It wasn't able to find a type file. And that's fine, but what's nice is it did at least generate a stub for us. So now if we go back over to our project, I'll just open up the flow types folder here. This is what it just added for us. Let me open up the pad just so that you can see. So all it's doing here is defining the module pad, and then also defining under it the types of parameters that it accepts. So now just go back over here, let's close this up, close up this file, go back to our A, and let's start using the pad library. So just like everything else, I need to declare flow at the top within this comment, and I'll require our pad function from npm here. And then let's call it using the parameters that I know work. So we can pass in 5, we'll pad, and we'll pad it with dashes. So if I call this, and let me just clear the terminal here, if I type flow, I get no error. So it's smart enough to know that nothing's wrong so far, but let's see if it's smart enough to catch an actual error. So I'll pass true, which is wrong, and so 2 parameters here is not correct. And in fact, I have the Visual Studio plugin here, so it's telling me exactly what's wrong with it, that it's reading out of the type file. But I'll type flow again here in our terminal. You'll see here the important line up at the top is line 4, where it says that we called pad with true, and it knows that that's not a valid way to call this function. So let's clear that here. We'll do an npm install Lodash, and I'll save that as an npm dependency. And now I just happen to know that this is not one that's currently supported, so I'll type flow typed installed again. And as it goes out, you'll see here it could not find Lodash, so it generated stubs for it instead. But with Lodash, stubs aren't as interesting. So if we just call Lodash here, so I'll var underscore equals require Lodash, and then let's just try to call it with something that we know does not exist, something like does not exist. So this should throw an error, but unlike pad, where we had a nice type file, we don't have one for Lodash, so there's nothing that flow can actually check in order to see whether this is correct or not. And sure enough, when we type flow in the console, we get no errors.